Welcome into another Key of David podcast here on Zion Media. I am joined by Lancelot Weaver, Trevor the Keys, and it's early morning. And how do you know that? Because I got my early morning sweater on. But we have been having a discussion, and that discussion has been about the topic of polygamy. And it was about 20, and I made an error. When I had my own personal experience, it was 2015, not 2014. And I don't know why I said 2014, but it was 2015. And Lance also started to have kind of an awakening a little bit about the same time as me about this topic of polygamy. We're going to go to his site. And Lance, I would love to know the history of when you started putting together your, what do we even call it, your manifesto. And Trevor, who was it in history that, was it Martin Luther? Tell me the background, because this is what it reminds me of.
Yeah, I mean, it was Martin Luther, and he had the manifesto that he went and nailed to the door of the church.
That 95 thesis.
Yeah. It was a big deal.
So Lance, tell us a little bit about your Martin Luther moment.
Yeah, I think I could kind of compare it to that, but then it's different as well. Like, because when I first started having like these really strong thoughts and kind of dreams, like I remember feeling like I'm sure a lot of reformers have, and a lot of young people in the church in general, like, how on earth has the church got these wrong? It's so obvious. Like, if you read the scriptures, this is so obvious. How's the church got it wrong, But anyway, that's kind of a viewpoint of a young person, I think, that needs to grow in their faith. Like, with time, I don't see myself as like Martin Luther, like totally destroyed the church and started so many wars and was a complete bigot. And it's like, in some ways, it's great to be compared to Martin Luther. In a lot of other ways, it's very horrible because, man, there was a lot of horrible fruits that came from Martin Luther, along with the good ones.
I mean, I've heard Martin Luther spoken highly of from the, apostles and prophets.
Yeah.
Like my whole life.
Yeah. I mean, it just depends on which way you look at it. He started hundreds of years worth of wars and was very anti-Semitic, like so anti-Jewish. And kind of was a key figure even in Nazi Jewish persecution.
Really?
Full on. I mean, he was very anti-Semitic. But anyway,
pull your mic up a little bit. When you turn your head sideways, it gets good.
A little muffled.
Yeah.
So yeah, like my big thing is I just like, so my whole site, this whole idea of universalism, like my kind of goal with my site, like I think that if people really understand these principles, they really won't leave the church. Right? I mean, like we've said lots of times, we are all in on the church, right? And I think that, me and a lot of people have had their kind of like faith crisis moment where they like kind of distance themselves from the church a little bit. But it's kind of like just a part of growing in your faith and realizing like, no, I mean, salvation is in the community. Like I've read hundreds of these, channel texts, thousands of pages of these incredible texts, and they all like have these very common threads, and the biggest one is like salvation is in the group. Like, it's very difficult to be saved alone. You're saved in groups, and so it's like, pick your group, and we've picked our group, and our group is the LDS Church. It's the Church of Jesus Christ.
Can you pull the mic a little closer to you? It's just it's a little quiet. I don't know what it is.
I don't know what happened, Lance. We've never had issues with your mic. It's really quiet.
Hey, is it?
There it is. It's really good now.
Okay. Yeah, I just turned it up. I think that sometimes it gets locked in. Can you guys hear me pretty good now?
Yeah, it's perfect.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so I think I want to preface this whole thing with that, it's so important to be part of group. Like, it is my, firm belief that it is almost impossible to be saved outside of a group. It's like, why does everyone say that community is like such the part of the church that they miss the most? It's because that is the salvation of the church. It's the community. Right. It's a group of believers getting together, and it's almost like, I heard the analogy or read the analogy in one of these books where it's like, if you try and play an instrument and you're alone, if you get one note wrong, everyone knows it. But if you are in a big group and everyone's playing a group and you get one note wrong, no one even notices. And that's the same way with our vibration. Like, as we're rising our vibration to try and actually, like, salvation is about rising the amount of light, the amount of spirit and light that's in your body. And you have to be perfect, like perfectly balanced and harmonic to find that salvation alone. But in a group, it's way, 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 way easier.
And the law of one really harps on that.
Yeah, yeah. And OASB. It's like you have to have a brotherhood. You have to have a group. You have to be working towards good. That's what salvation is on
It's
on
like
earth.
that hive mind. It's the mastermind concept. It's important.
Yeah, it's the key to success. It's the key to happiness. It's the key to family. It's like that group is your extended family. So even though in this section, we're going to talk about my site, and I have this reform site, and it is kind of like a Martin Luther, like I am pushing for reforms in these certain things. They are so like inconsequential compared to the idea of like we're not here to like be activists. We're here to just offer suggestions, be like, hey, like all of mine are totally scriptural based. Why don't we relook at these scriptures? And why don't we be open to the idea that maybe we've got it wrong, and that's okay, but that doesn't need to affect our testimony.
And don't you think that if we can become one, because we have, especially right now with this hot topic of polygamy, and we're going to talk about that, if we could all come together, it would increase our, it would bless us in great ways because we wouldn't have this divide. We would become one. And what does the Savior say about becoming one? If you're not one, you are not mine. And so we are trying to have these discussions to create some oneness. So these schisms that are happening right now, we can get through them. Okay. Do we want to jump into your site?
Yeah. Let's jump into it. And let me just show, because a lot of these things, I think I have one article that I think is just so fundamental to all these concepts we're going to talk about. And I think that a lot of times we put our testimony of the church over our testimony of Christ, right? And I think that's really dangerous, right? Like so my article that talks about the only true church, like tries to make this point that's like the only true church is actually the church in heaven. Like if you read the scriptures, and great one is D&C 10 that we always skip over, where he says, "This is my doctrine: whoever repenteth and cometh unto me, the same is my church. And whoso declareth more or less than this, the same is not of me, but is against me. Therefore, he is not my church." Right? Those are strong words. Like, holy cow. And we almost just always sideline those scriptures, and instead we just like put D&C 1, 20 up on a pedestal, and it's like, well, look, we're the only true church, and all the other ones are false. And in the past, they've even been like, they're all the devil, they're Satan, But it's like, no.
And what does the Savior say if they're not against us?
Yeah,
They're for us?
And I mean, in this article, I go through those exact concepts because there's multiple scriptures, right? You've got one that's like, who is not with me is against me, and another one, who is not against us is for us. So it's like, well, which one is it? Is it we're church and we're true and everyone else is false? Or we're, they're true and we're all false? How does it work? And it's like, no, if you really go through the scriptures one at a time and look at every single one of them, you kind of get this clear picture that's like, oh, wow, there is like this dichotomy in scripture, and it's like the church of God and the church of the devil. And it's pretty clear that the church of the devil cannot preach of Christ. Like anyone who's teaching good is part of the church of Christ in that moment. Anyway, we'll cover this in another video, I think. But I just want to hit the point that it's like, if you have your ducks in a row, if you have your testimony with Christ at the foundation instead of the church at the foundation, and then Christ's prophets and apostles are built on top of that, right? We don't have them incorrectly laid out. We have our foundation laid out right. Then we can talk about these things like whether Joseph Smith screwed up about polygamy and not lose our testimony. Like
Right,
your
right.
your shelf, a shelf breaking moment. I think that's a horrible analogy. Like to call it a shelf is kind of dumb. I wish that people would call it like a tumbling building. My building tumbled, because then you could really use the scriptural analogies, which for thousands of years they've been using to help us understand. It's like if your building is breaking, your shelf is breaking. If your building is breaking, it's because your foundation was not built correctly.
Right.
You probably put your apostle, your testimony of some
And
leader of the church over Christ.
Maybe it needs to tumble so it can be rebuilt.
Absolutely. Yep. And I make that exact same point in another one of my articles. That's like you almost have to lose your testimony multiple times, like have it shattered over and over to really gain it and have it be strengthened. Like that's just part of the faith process. And we should, I think if we more commonly really taught that and help the young people to understand that, it's like expect your building to tumble a couple times and then just rebuild it. You're building a faith. And that's just a natural process of the faith progression, like this Fowler stages of faith, of getting up to where you universalize your faith. And once you've truly universalized your faith, you'll never lose your faith.
Exactly. When you say universalize your faith, I mean, I know what you mean, but explain what that means.
Yeah, and if you go like in my site, I have a like in my about page, um, really goes into like what Christian universalism is. Christian universalism is like this concept that like it basically stands in contrast. It's the opposite of like Christian fundamentalism, right? And a Christian fundamentalist like has a very myopic view where they see their church as everything, and they have no clue how to fit other doctrines and concepts and ideas into theirs because theirs is the only truth, and anything that doesn't fit with theirs they just reject.
And we
And so
have it.
that
I mean, that's a huge issue in our own culture, don't you think?
oh, for sure, for sure. And I mean it's expected because we we were raised, you could say, as a church
The
out in
traditions
out
of
in the
our
wilderness.
fathers. Yeah.
We were separated, so we couldn't even have a discourse with the rest of Christianity because they hated us, and so we had this like totally isolationist view of the world. And I think that God does that on purpose, and that's kind of part of my thesis on the site. Is it's like, well, God actually creates churches in kind of an egocentric, selfish way. That's just part of the stages of faith. It's like in the temple, how we go through all the different stages before we're exalted. Like, even if you're the prophet, you go in there and you start with the first principles and ordinances. You start with the lowest and go through every ordinance of the priesthood, like every time. Why? And the first ordinances are pretty kind of egocentric. That's just how the church, like David in
Yeah, and that's a very
the Bible,
telestial thing, right?
we
Which
go
is
through the
part,
telestial kingdom. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
which is part of progressing through the telestial kingdom.
Yep. Yep. And so just because the church, when it started out, right? I mean, Brigham Young's the best example. We all know Brigham Young was like kind of a, I mean, on one hand, he was a badass, you could say, and on the other hand, he was like a total dictator. Like, holy cow, man! But I love Brigham. Like, that's what the church needed at the time, right?
Yeah.
It's like he's like David in the Bible. I mean, David in the Bible was like he killed thousands of people. If you believe the biblical numbers, hundreds of thousands. He's like going out and just murdering everybody in battle because he's just an unbelievable warrior, him and Saul. But he was kind of needed to make Israel into something. Because this is a crazy concept, and it's like a philosophical concept that I think once you get, then you can understand the sin. And this is all building into this idea of us accepting the fact that Joseph might have screwed up. He might have sinned, and then that's okay. Right? I mean, the gospel is always coming through very flawed people. And David was a very flawed person, right? Like, our understanding is that David actually lost his salvation, right? He basically murdered Uriah by sending him on the front line so that he could sleep with his wife. And by that, he lost his salvation. But God gave him the promise that he wouldn't leave him in hell, but that he would go to hell, right? And so, but yet, that is the chosen seed that Christ chose to come through Judah, through David, right? He was going to be like the return of David, right? They're even looking for Messiah ben David still.
Yeah, exactly. So you're right. On one hand, it's like, hey, we know this. On the other hand, it's like he is still held in super high regard.
Yeah, I mean, he was a prophet. He was a man after God's own heart. Like, he was a prophet, but yet he sinned big. But does that make everything that Israel is? Does that make the church of Israel false because David messed up? Because he let his lusts get over him, take advantage of him and win him, and so that he did stupid things? Like, no. But there's tons of examples, even to Abraham, being so faithless that he has to, sleep with a handmaid instead of what God had promised him. Like, instead of having faith, like, the scriptures are full of examples of basically the birthright son who thinks that he's so righteous and that he should be the one who gets the birthright, and that the gospel comes through, loses it. And God instead chooses someone who sinned in some big way, someone who is prideful.
I literally, I don't know if you guys have seen this new movie that's out called Mufasa.
Oh, I haven't seen it yet. Is it good?
So it's the backstory of Mufasa and Scar, and it is literally a type and a shadow of birthright son, and Mufasa is this stray adopted son into this kingly family, and Mufasa ends up becoming the king. Yeah, it's this story is in Disney movies.
Yeah, and how many of the scriptural, like, the strongest motifs and stories within the Bible. Like these stories end up following them because that they're so iconic. It's always that. It's always the underdog. It's always the guy who, like, even Joseph, like this prideful little kid, who like his brothers hate because he's probably so prideful, because his dad's chosen him and he's definitely not the birthright son, and yet he gets chosen to be put above everyone else, right? And that's us. Like we are the seed of Joseph, right? We are like following that archetype, that motif as a church. And so, like, just because our Joseph sinned, does that make our church somehow not true? No, it makes him more true. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Like, that shouldn't be something that ever breaks our shelf. Like if we're founded on the right foundation, we'll see these motifs in Scripture, and we'll be like, oh, yeah, well, we should expect that. And so, anyway, let's go through and jump to this actual topic of polygamy. And if people want to, they can go through.
Can we, Trevor? How do we make this bigger? Do you know how we do this?
Taller. Yeah, maybe it won't. Or maybe if I change the aspect
Lance
ratio.
has to zoom on his page. Like if you're on you can command plus.
Look, it does it if I do that.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
There we go.
There we go.
Go
Okay.
even to where like the right-hand column is gone, Lance.
Well, I guess that does do a little good.
No, just keep zooming. Eventually it'll. Well, you're getting worse now.
Yeah.
Okay, now zoom. Let's zoom in on this.
So that the text is a little bigger.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just call that.
Can we zoom in on that?
All right. That's probably good enough. Okay.
Yeah, I can read it pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Walk us through what are we looking at here?
So, I mean, I just want to make sure people understand, like I say in this thing, like I don't say any of these things to be dogmatic or divisive or be like, this is the truth. Like, but these are things to think of and for people to pray about. And I think that as the church thinks about these topics, then God will send revelation, right? And the prophet will end up confirming that, because I think that he basically receives revelation for what the church is ready for. And a lot of that ends up just being what the group mind of the church, right, has a consensus for. And so that brings the church up as a group. So these are just things to think about. But the idea of polygamy is a huge one, right? And maybe in the future we'll talk about a couple other things, like, just going through some ideas that it's like there are a couple things that we end up doing as a church that are a little bit culty that we probably could think about.
I just find it so interesting. I'm seeing these dates, and this was a time period for myself. I mean, I was in prison during this time, but that was the time of my own enlightenment. It's like there must have been some energy that was coming to the earth, because and I told Lance this before we started the podcast, like Lance has no idea what his gathered in one site did for me, because while I was in prison, I had all of these things. Trevor's seen it. I have a stack of notes that is like in a yellow folder, and it's all of the things that were coming to me. It's like if Lance wrote his blog by pencil, like that's what it is. In fact, I'll grab it so you guys can see it.
This was probably about the time that the church essays were coming out too.
This is my blog
Oh, that's awesome.
of what was happening to me. And so when I got out, I'm like, is anybody else having this same vision, this same thought, this same feeling? And I found Lance's site, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm looking at the time frames of when I got stuff and he was getting stuff, and I'm just like, we were going through it at the same time, and we had no clue who each other was.
Yeah, isn't that cool? And and the law of one goes into detail about that, right? Because the law of one brings up this social memory complex concept, which is that a group can somehow form a cohesive, like, subconscious link to each other, but that actually takes like trials and tribulations or something to really, and a matter of faith, to create this like it's in the spirit world, but they create this social memory complex, and you can see each other's thoughts.
You said something really interesting, and I have found this in a book called In Tune with the Infinite. And I had already thought, like in my head, I'm like, we're doing something when we're just not asleep. When we go to sleep, we're just not just sleeping. Like our spirit is doing something. Our spirit is traveling. Our spirit is getting education, or it is giving education. And so when I found Lance's site, I'm like, my spirit somehow is connecting to this guy's spirit, and he and I are having discussions, and then we're going back after we come, wake up, and in our waking state we're writing down whatever happened when we're sleeping. And so like that's why I'm so religious about my sleep, because I view it as a time that I am either learning or helping somebody else learn or learning collectively.
Yeah. And these are pretty big, like, and important esoteric thoughts, like the idea that, because how many of these things came to me in dreams, and the same with yours, like, and a lot of people actually have visions. What is that vision? It's like we are connected when you can actually form that social memory complex. So as a church, when we truly become one on this like subconscious higher level, we can see each other's thoughts, we can communicate with each other in dreams. So even if we're not totally aware of what's going on in the real world, like we actually receive revelation. That's the spirit, right? And
Well,
so,
and
and
think of how divisive for a husband and a wife the concept of polygamy might be, and so that concept might be blocking a oneness, because the wife, even though she might not even say it, is like, I don't like this idea that I have to share my husband. Or the husband might be in a place where he's like, well, I can't wait to get me seven virgins, because that's the doctrine, and this is, we just got to do what God tells us to, and that does not create a oneness, and so it doesn't allow that group mind to begin to form. But anyways, okay,
no, that's a
let's jump
great
into
point,
it.
because the same idea in a couple as in the church in general. Like, and in my life, this has been one of the things that just in the last 5 years, I have more and more come to the conclusion that I think that if Joseph Smith did reveal polygamy, that it was very short lived, and that it was just a
Right.
mistake. It was absolutely a mistake, and that he
Right, and
regretted it.
that's why you
And
get the record of him preaching against it,
yeah,
and that's why you get the record of him telling people he's for it.
yeah,
And so you could only get that. Both of those can be true if at one point he thought it was right, and at another point he learned that it wasn't, and so you would get both, and so both would then be true. But then you have to then say Joseph made a mistake. And I see here that you say, embrace that prophets make mistakes. We know in the Bible that that happens. We already
yeah,
know that.
yeah.
But we're okay with David making the mistake, to your point earlier. But for whatever reason, we're not okay if our beloved prophet Joseph Smith made a
Yeah,
mistake.
yeah. Or Brigham
Okay.
Young. Like, how many
Or Brigham
people
Young.
have we
Yeah.
read, even in the comments, who might like our stuff and are just like, Brigham Young was so horrible and the church is apostate. And this is another idea that we'll have to do a whole nother video. Like, our whole concept of apostasy needs to be completely reformed. Our idea of apostasy is making people go apostate. Like, it's crazy to me, right? How messed up was Israel? Like, think about Israel when God established the covenant with Moses, right? Abraham before that, and Moses. You take the history of Israel from Moses to the time of Christ, when Israel was rejected, right? When Israel went into true apostasy, in other words, they were rejected and lost the priesthood at the time of Christ. But yet God was so long suffering and kept them his people, his church, his true church, all the way from Moses to the time of Christ. Even though they were like, at some points, they were sacrificing children. They were worshiping Baal. They had altars in the temple worshiping Baal. They were so evil, so apostate. And yet God did not take away their priesthood. Their priesthood was valid from Moses to the time of Christ. And in fact, even then, the whole apostasy idea is that they rejected the Savior. And so God said, well, I'm just taking the gospel from you and I'm giving it to another people. I'm giving it to the Gentiles. And if any of you want to be a part of that, you're going to have to leave your national heritage and become part of this new church, right? And so it's like and that was his church. Like, so our idea, I have an entire article talking about the great apostasy and how our concept of it is basically just an adaptation of Protestantism. Like, it's not based on the scriptures. But let's not get into that. But it's like, we just need to understand how long suffering God is. Like, the church is not in apostasy right now. If you think like, oh, because Joseph Smith messed up, or because Brigham Young messed up, right, or because they accepted a lower law and lived a little lower, that God like rejected them and now their priesthood is no good, you don't get the gospel. You built your testimony on a completely sandy, horrible foundation that isn't based on Jesus Christ and his mercy and long suffering, right? If you just change the way you think, your life's going to be a lot better. And you're
Lance,
gonna
I need you to say that line again because I'm writing it down in my notes section for our merch store. What was it? understanding of apostasy is creating apostasy, or what was
Yeah,
it?
yes.
What did you
Uh,
say?
our that's a good one. I can't remember exactly how I said it. Our
Yeah,
understanding of
rewind it.
apostasy leads to apostasy.
I'm gonna make a shirt out of that, dude.
For real.
Your understanding of apostasy is causing you to apostatize, or I don't know, something like that. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. We will have a whole, and you can look at my article on that. Okay, but let's get into that because our idea here is that prophets make
Hashtag
mistakes.
disavow polygamy.
Yeah,
Okay, maybe that's a shirt in and of itself.
yeah. Okay, and so some of the points we want to hit. First of all, it's like this is a really interesting quote if people haven't read it, by Emma, right? So her son interviews her just a couple years before she dies, right? And says like, did Joseph Smith reveal polygamy, right? So this is Joseph Smith the third, Joseph's son, asking Emma, what about the revelation on polygamy? Did Joseph Smith have anything like it? What of spiritual wifery? Emma says, there was no revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives. There were some rumors or something of the sort, which I asked my husband. He assured me that all of it, that all there was of it, that in a chat about plural wives, he'd said, well, such a system might be possible if everyone was agreed to it and would behave as they should. In other words, like do it as righteous as possible, not hurting each other in any way. But they would not. And besides, it was contrary to the will of heaven. No such thing as polygamy or spiritual wifery was taught publicly or privately before my husband's death that I have now or ever had knowledge of. Right? Did he have other wives than yourself? He had no other wife but me, nor did he do knowledge. Right? So, like, people need to understand this one concept. And this is super important, and this is something that I feel like Michelle Stone never hits. And so many people let this like basically lead them out of the church, and it really bothers me. There was a conspiracy. Okay, like there are two choices here that you have to believe. You have to believe one, that either Joseph, Hiram, and Emma completely lied and conspired to cover up polygamy. That's choice one. Or choice two, that Brigham and his cohorts completely lied and conspired to cover up what the truth about Joseph. Like those are your two choices. Like you can't get past this, and this is incredibly important. And once again, our discussion leading up to this was so important because this is so easy. Like when I was confronted with this paradox, that it's like really those are the only two choices. It's very easy to be like, oh man, the church is so untrue. This is so messed up. But once again, if you have that thought, it's because your testimony is based on some messed up principles. And I get it because the church's understanding is still young right now, but that's fine. That's cool. That's where we're at. No problem. Those are your choices, right? Because Joseph Smith specifically said, no, he taught against it. No, don't do it. Emma specifically flat out, either she is lying here or she's telling the truth, right? And if so, let's say that this the whole movement is true. That Michelle's leading up, and that Joseph Smith actually never espoused polygamy and only taught against it. Let's say that Emma is telling the truth. Well, what does that require? That requires us to believe that there's a pretty big conspiracy and cover-up led by Brigham Young and a number of the head apostles, where they went through and they created D&C 132. They changed all sorts of things. They forged they did a lot, right? Because there's a lot of really strong evidence. And that's why we have so many people being like, well, it had to have happened. Like, this is kind of cool too, because when I was young, we just didn't even touch this concept in church. And then when the topic essays came out and all this information started to come with Mormon stories and all the people who were really thinking about it and putting it online, it was so troubling for everyone because it's like, well, the church has totally covered this up. How could they? They're so dishonest. But when I get into it and I come to this paradox, it helps me realize it's like, I think I know why the church didn't touch this. It's because when Joseph F. Smith, and more importantly, when Joseph Fielding Smith started getting into this, they came to realize this exact same conundrum. And they're like, well, we can't know the truth. Like it's one of these, but I don't know. The truth is hidden from me. I don't know which one it is. So let's just not talk about it.
Why do you think?
That's great.
Because to me, you could be like, this is not even worth even talking about. But here's why it's important to me. And it's John 17:3. This is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. And for me, it's like understanding God, would be to understand his relationship. Is he monogamous or not? And so that to me is why the discussion is important. And I often wonder why, because anybody can do this. You don't have to just be the prophet, because we know that there is this like, I don't know what to do here. Why not go and petition the Lord like Kimball did about blacks in the priesthood? Why not take it to the Lord humbly? Is it because it's a lose-lose either way you look at it? So it's like, I don't even want to take it to the Lord, so I'd rather just plead ignorance.
I mean, I think like blacks and priesthood is a great example. It's like, why didn't they figure it out back then? Well, because they were in a world that wasn't ready for the truth.
A world
They
of
didn't-
bias.
Exactly.
So bias clouds revelation.
Yeah. And I mean,
Okay.
I've okay. So anyway, I think that it's the same thing with Brigham and these guys. Like they had hearts. Like that's where the church was, right? In the same way that the Israel during the time of David was in like a completely imperialistic phase that was going and killing everybody to conquer all their land. That's where the church was. There were so many people in the church who had kind of lustful hearts, right? That they couldn't know the truth because they didn't want to know the truth. Now, do we really want to know the truth now? I think as soon as the church is completely open to the truth, when we are completely open to be like, look, our foundation, our testimony is structured in such a way where Jesus Christ, not the church or Joseph Smith or anything, is at the foundation, and that we understand that God works his ways through very imperfect people who create pretty heinous sins when we think about David, and that's okay. Like when we truly have our testimony structured in a correct way, we will be able, and we're ready, we'll be able to ask God. Like the prophet will at that point ask God and be like they'll all get together, just like they did with blacks and priesthood, and say, what's the truth? And suddenly the truth will just be obvious to them.
Yeah. And as I've, and I don't share this very often, but as I've kind of petitioned the Lord on this, I'm like, when does this happen? It's been, to me, it's like, well, when and if Holland gets into that seat, that's when this will happen. That's what basically has been confirmed, at least to me, for me. So, okay, well, let's jump back into your article here because I like where you're going with this, May 26, 1844.
Yeah. So let's just read this second quote, right? So we got Joseph Smith himself saying, you know, what a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives. I can only find one. I'm the same man. I'm as innocent as I was 14 years ago. I can prove all the perjurers, right? So here we have, again, like either Joseph Smith is lying, and that is the predominant thesis right now, that he is like stretching the truth and that Emma was a complete liar, right? Or Brigham Young was the liar, right? Or I guess the other third one you could say is that they're both lying, like both Brigham Young and Emma and Joseph, that they all lied about this.
Yeah, and furthermore, here's what causes me to be like, so Joseph was the head of this thing, and if he knew that these guys were doing this thing, why did he allow them to maintain their apostleship? Why didn't he just be like, hey, you're out? Why didn't he tell them, stop doing this? Like, why did it take until 1844 for him to start really speaking up and saying this is a problem? Like, why was this not a problem in 1841 with John C. Bennett? Why wasn't this a problem and him telling these guys, don't do this? Were they hiding it from him? And if they were, how are they hiding it from the guy who's leading the church?
Yeah.
Furthermore, the guy that's the prophet, and wouldn't he be receiving some revelation that, hey, these guys are doing this thing and you need to let them go? Had no problem letting Oliver Cowdery go.
Yeah. And I mean, and this is my belief, and really it's the same as yours and your vision. It's interesting that we came to it, you know, around a similar time, completely different, unrelated, and we didn't know each other and read each other's stuff at all. I believe, and the more I've kind of wrestled over this, it's just what I feel, that Joseph Smith opened the door to polygamy, that he entertained the idea for like a year and a half. And I don't think that he ever took a plural wife, right? I think he's telling the truth when he says, and I think Emma was telling the truth, that they never took a plural wife. I don't know whether that maybe he did something a little foggy, maybe even slept with someone. I don't know. But I think that he did not take a plural wife. He did not truly like introduce a doctrine, but he opened the door to the doctrine.
That
That
makes a lot
somehow
of sense.
somehow he did do something wrong, right? Because in the Doctrine and Covenants, I have some scriptures in here too, where it's like God says specifically, like, if you do everything that's right, I am going to like uphold you and protect you and save you. And it's like, but that didn't happen. He
Right.
was killed, right? And he kind
Right.
of let himself be killed. It's almost like he was trying to atone for his sins, in my
Well,
view.
in William Marks's one of his accounts, it says that when Joseph comes back to Nauvoo, he's getting ready to retreat. He's told by the Lord to come back because he had to atone for the crimes he had committed.
Yeah.
And that's what he tells at least William Marks. So what you're saying makes the most sense, at least in my mind, as you try to wrap your head around everything that's going on. To what extent he did, I don't know.
Yeah. And I
To
don't
what?
care. And we
Yeah.
don't care. It's like you you don't it's almost silly. You're almost creating like this crazy idol in your mind. If you picture the prophets as like these perfect people who aren't confronted with the same problems as the rest of us and don't sin
Right.
like the rest of us. Like, instead of putting Jesus Christ as God and as the only perfect person, you're trying to put the prophets as that. You're trying to make Joseph Smith as that. Like, come on. Come on, don't
Right.
create that idol. Like, these guys were men, and Joseph Smith, he did amazing things. Like, holy cow! But if he like, even if he ended up sleeping with someone, which I don't know, wait, like, why speculate on that? I think that whatever it was pretty minor.
I agree with you.
And he's still a prophet, and the Book of Mormon is
Yeah.
still true. Like, holy cow, the Book of Mormon is so true. And if you haven't had an experience where you've read that book and had the truth of it burn in your entire body, like your whole body is on fire, like, keep reading it, because holy cow, everyone should have that experience. Everyone should realize, like, this is so true, and that Joseph Smith really does point us to Christ, and that the church's destiny, even though we might go through some rocky stuff, like, it's possible maybe Joseph Smith ended up like almost on purpose becoming like an archetype of what the church will go through itself. In the same way you could say that Moses or David kind of were archetypes of what Israel would go through. Joseph Smith is an archetype, and maybe the church will readopt polygamy at one point in the future. And then it will prove like their downfall for a short time. My testimony is it doesn't matter. Like, God will pick us up, and he will take the remnant of whoever has their faith in Jesus Christ, right? And as long as, like, stay with the body of the church, stay with the people who have faith, stay with the people who have Jesus Christ at their helm, and he will make something great of us. Like, I have a very strong testimony that the church is destined for like some pretty amazing things. Like, it's happening right now, and it has happened in the past. I mean, holy cow, after this crazy thing that absolutely made the church collapse in Nauvoo, right, in Kirtland on Nauvoo, the church failed, it collapsed, and yet he took the remnant and he brought them into the wilderness and basically created a new nation. Like, what other church can say that? In the U.S., none. It's absolutely amazing what Brigham Young did. It's absolutely amazing what God has done with the church. Like, how can you not see his hand in the settling of the entire Western United States? How amazing. I want to be part of that. And all it takes is just understanding that that's how God works. He takes flawed people. He takes people who screw up. Like, let's just be okay with the fact that prophets sin, and let's just be totally open to whatever the truth is and just try and get at it, not lose our testimonies over it.
Okay, so
Let's go a little
I
bit
love that DNC 3:4 there that I read. I just think it's sometimes we forget what our own scriptures say.
Yeah, this whole idea, it's like they can sin. Yeah, and then and even if they fall, did David fall? Yeah, he fell, but he repented, and God told him he would not leave his soul in hell. He was a man after God's own heart. He was a prophet of God,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so let's go a little bit further. I mean, I have a lot of stuff people can go here if they want, right? But if our history is somewhat like the Jews' history, where we're a stiff-necked people, right, and we despise the words of blame it, and God delivers us to things that we can't understand because we desired it, and God had to, hey, well, we know we're Israel, so be it. So be it. But that's where salvation lies, is going through and making mistakes and then picking ourselves up and then keep pressing forward and having faith and staying with the group, like we talked about at the very beginning. It's all
Okay.
about that community of the group.
Now you're going to get into DNC 132 here. I see you were way ahead of the game. I was too. Now everybody's talking about 132. There's a whole channel called 132 Problems. But you were way ahead of the game in kind of seeing the inconsistencies, it looks like, of 132.
Yeah, and I mean, and I go into that a little bit, and I don't want to dwell on 132 as much, even though I really do lean to the idea that Brigham Young fully edited 132. Like if you've read like Without Disclosing My Identity, which is kind of a wacky book by a wacky guy too, it has some interesting ideas and it gives an edition of the actual D&C 132, and then the parts that Brigham Young added to clarify it. And this is another point I want to hit really quick. So this is my belief. Like I like to give everybody the benefit of the doubt that they're coming at things from a good heart. Like I think that Brigham Young was a good man, even if he did go off on his mission and probably commit adultery. And I think that he tried to do good, right? I think that and I think it's a real possibility and a likelihood that Brigham Young really did edit all of these revelations, that he did a ton to try and justify polygamy. I actually think that he did it to protect Joseph Smith because he believed, because like I said, I think that Joseph Smith opened the door to polygamy. I think he taught some teachings for a short period of time, and then Brigham Young went away on a mission, and a lot of these guys were convinced, like, yeah, Joseph Smith totally said polygamy was good. And then Joseph Smith turned on that and started teaching against it, and I don't know who it was. I don't think that Brigham Young or any of those guys were involved in his death. I think it was other people who had left the church and been excommunicated at that time, conspired, murdered him, and then Brigham Young is trying to make sense of everything. And he's like, well, I know that this is like, Joseph Smith like revealed this. He didn't, and he believed all those guys' lies because there were so many lies going on. So after Joseph Smith opened the door, then he tried to close it, and then he excommunicated these guys, and then they start throwing away so many lies, and everyone's like, who do we believe? Who do we believe? I think Brigham Young believed a bunch of the lies and then changed all these things to try and protect Joseph Smith. And he was kind of operating on his belief on that Joseph Smith really did open the door to polygamy and that he really did preach it. And he was trying to like make it work in his mind and probably did a couple little nefarious things in there, but not really. I think that for the most part, all of these guys were acting on good faith, except for the ones who had gotten excommunicated and full on gave their hearts to the devil and decided they were going to conspire to murder Joseph Smith. Right? Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, because I think in the church, I don't hear this view. What I hear is this split that's happening right now. And like half of them are taking Joseph Smith's side and saying Brigham Young is an evil, horrible person. And in their mind, they're going a little bit apostate. And half of them are taking Brigham Young's side and saying that Joseph Smith and Emma were kind of just liars. Right? And I don't see that middle ground where it's like, look, you know what? They can both have completely had good intentions, including Brigham Young. Like, even if Joseph made the mistake, even if he opened the door, Brigham Young can still have good intentions and have been doing this to try and protect Joseph and to try and piece things together through the lies that he had believed in as best he could.
Right.
We don't have to label Brigham Young as evil.
And there are lots of really righteous, really good people that ended up practicing polygamy because they were following what they believed at the time was commanded by God. And so you get the people that are like, well, I descend from a polygamous line, so does that make me a bad person? No, they were doing what they thought was the best. And ultimately, God took them, after 40 years in the wilderness. I find it really interesting. They leave around that they get to the Salt Lake Valley around 1847, 1850 time period. 40 years later in 1890 is when they start coming out saying, okay, this is over. And so they're in this wilderness of polygamy, and then they stop its practice to an extent, and a great extent where you can't physically have more than one wife, but they still have the remnants of that doctrine are still even today in our church.
Yeah, and it kind of happens about the time that Hiram's kids start taking the helm of the church, right? It's like Joseph and Hiram, the church finally passes back into their birthright, into their seat again with Joseph F. Smith, who kind of hides it, but then by the time Joseph Fielding Smith comes around, it's like they've completely shut it down. And that's okay. That's okay. I like my ancestors, like one of my main direct line through my mom and my grandma is this guy named Moses Harris, right? And he came from back east with Joseph. He's a little bit older than Joseph, but he came back east, went to California, then came to Utah. He settled tons of towns in Utah, including Harrisville, if you've seen that, right by St. George, including Washington, the city of Washington by St. George. Then he ended up getting buried near Orderville. And it's kind of interesting because he wouldn't take a second wife. So he was asked to take a second wife, and he wasn't going to do it. He kept one wife. But his kids for 2 generations did, and so I've got all these polygamists from his children because he had a ton of posterity. Even though he had one wife, they had like 10 kids or something like that.
And isn't that interesting that you find that people that had one wife end up having just as much posterity
Yeah.
in the ratio as those who took on. So it really didn't do the idea that it was to raise up seed.
Yeah.
Like if that's what it is, honestly, Joseph Smith did a horrible job because he didn't have any seed outside of Emma. So you can make the argument, and I think it's exactly like you said. Somewhere along the line, he made some mistake. To what extent? Who knows? And who cares? He made some mistake, recognized the mistake, and then did what he could to start unwinding it, but ultimately went back, atoned for whatever that mistake was, and died a martyr.
Yep. Yep. Follow Jesus into the grave, right? And so this idea of raise up seed, let's hit that right now because I think that's a huge one. This is a nuanced thing that it's another concept I think we argue about and we get it wrong, right? Because you have one camp saying it's like, oh, well, God made polygamy to like have lots of kids. And look, it totally worked, increase the population. And then we have another camp that says, no, actually, you don't have more kids. Polygamous groups don't have more. Like the truth is actually kind of nuanced. It's in the middle. Like if you look at the population of Colorado City, they absolutely had way more kids than a like non-polygamous group. But it doesn't actually have to do with the polygamy. It's not the polygamy that makes it have more kids. It's the culture. It's the culture of that your goal is to have lots of kids. And it doesn't matter whether you're polygamous or non-polygamous. It's just whether you have a culture where you're like, we are going to try and teach our women and encourage them to have tons of kids because holy cow, it's a sacrifice on both the guy and the girl's part. It's hard to, a selfish people has very few kids. And, their population is about to collapse. And that's when they get certain level of selfishness, populations just do collapse. I mean, we're about to have that happen right now. Let's hit this though. Okay, so raise up seed. I want people to really think about that, right? So if the scripture says, raise up seed, so Jacob 2:30, okay, this is hopefully people have enough of background when they're watching this so they understand what we're talking about. But in Jacob 2:30, the scripture that we're used so commonly to say, oh, God instituted polygamy in order to expand the population. And why do we believe that? Well, because we have this justification of Jacob 2:30 in the Book of Mormon where it says, look, God will command polygamy if he wants to raise up seed. That is a completely wrong interpretation of this verse. Raise up seed does not mean increase the population. Like, let everyone get that through their head. Like, where the heck did that come from? Who in their right mind, like, I'm sure it was Brigham Young, honestly, it thinks that raise up seed means raise the population. That's not what it means. Okay, so let's go through the scriptures and just really hit that home. Okay, to raise up seed does not in any way infer the use of polygamy to make many wives to multiply seed or increase the population. That is not what it means. Okay, it is a direct quote from Genesis 38:8, referring to a caveat in the Mosaic Law in Deuteronomy 25:5-7, which Christ himself referred to in Matthew 22:24, where if a man dies,
Levirate marriage.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. If a man dies without having children, his brother, even if already married, was to take his brother's wife, right, or widow, as a second wife in order to raise up seed in the name of the brother. Not to increase the population, but to raise up seed to his brother. Why? Right? In other words, to raise up an heir to the brother. Or if a wife is infertile, right? This is basically their way of doing in vitro, like of having taken care of infertility. If a wife was infertile, the second wife could also be taken to raise up seed to the family, like Abraham and Sarah. Right? Since in ancient law, property was tied exclusively to a man and their children, in this way the wife could bear a child who could still lay claim to the birthright and her dead husband's assets, and thus preserve the family name under civil law. Right? He's a surrogate. So this is really huge. I hope that, I would really love if the entire church could get this out of their mind, that raise up seed does not mean increase the population. It actually means be a surrogate too. Okay? That is what it means.
I wonder why they didn't just use like adoption. as a way to do it. Just must not have it really been a thing. Like nobody's really like giving up their child for adoption at that time because they had this in place instead of that.
Yeah, I mean, they had a very different culture, and the Middle East is still a little bit like
Yeah,
this. But I think that having your actual genetic seed propagated
it's
was a
important.
huge
It's
deal.
bloodline, right? So
Yeah,
they were very focused on bloodline, bloodline, bloodline.
absolutely. Right. So raise up seed is be a surrogate for. Okay, and this concept, like let's just read these scriptures really quick so that people can see it in action. All right, I'm just going to expand this. Right, so when we're talking about Judah, right, Judah and said unto Onan, go unto thy brother's wife and marry her and raise up seed to thy brother.
Ah, love
What's he
it.
saying? Be a surrogate for thy brother, right? Okay, Deuteronomy.
I like just so you know, the rest of the story is Onan basically spills his seed on the floor, and God slew him. So let that be a word to the wise, brethren. Don't spill your seed on the floor because God may slay you. Just putting it out there.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to that in 1 second, okay? Because I think there's
Okay.
even more to it than that. Okay, so anyway, in the Mosaic Law, we have the whole thing here where you can go and you can raise up to thy brother a name in Israel, right? You can raise up seed to thy brother, right? And Christ himself quotes this, if a man die having no children, his brother shall
Hey,
marry his
Lance,
wife.
everybody is missing this in the discussion.
No, I agree. I agree. And these are some points I really hope that kind of get out there, that people will kind
Yeah.
of
So
share
listen, if
this.
you got a channel, you're still Mormon, you're 132, take a hard look at this. I haven't seen this, the concept of what it actually means to raise up seed in the context of the scriptures. So include this in your overall thesis or theology or wherever you're going with this. Make sure that you include this.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe it was Joseph Smith who misunderstood this scripture and used it as a justification. I think it was Brigham Young, but it definitely then got passed down even to this day. And we haven't completely repented and understood that it's like this scripture in Jacob 2 is not talking about multiplying the population. It's talking about being a surrogate for.
That's right.
Okay.
It is truly talking about what is referred to in the Mosaic Law as levirate marriage.
Yeah. And there is an interesting aspect to this, right? So this is kind of crazy to me. Okay. So Judah, this is always like the main reference to this is like we just talked about here in Genesis 38 with Judah. And it's the exact same thing that we were talking about a minute ago, where it's an example of God bringing the birthright through a messed up line, right? Because remember, Paul makes a big deal about the fact that Christ came through Judah, right? And he's like there and nothing. There's no priesthood in Judah. Like they're asking him, like, well, why isn't he a Levite? He should be a priest after. And he's like, no, he's not a priest. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek, right? And Melchizedek wasn't from Abraham. Melchizedek was before Abraham. So Christ's priesthood comes from someone who's
And
actually
truthfully,
outside of Israel.
in Melchizedek, I was reading in Hebrews chapter 7, it says Melchizedek. So there's all these people who are like, oh, Melchizedek is Shem. Well, I got news for you. I think that's false too, based on scripture. In Hebrews chapter 7, it says Melchizedek didn't have a mother or a father.
Yeah, who knows? That's kind of wild. But okay, aside from, let's just get to the main point I'm trying to make here
Yeah.
is that, yeah, Judah, that this example of Christ raising up seed and coming through the line of Judah is an example of him coming through an unlikely, an unjustified, and messed up place. Right? Because everyone would think that the Messiah should have come through a Levite because he was going to be a priest, like the high priest of Israel. But instead, he came through Judah, where Paul says, where nothing is said of priesthood. He came through this crazy line. And what is so crazy about Judah's line? Well, Judah is the seed that Christ comes through. Like Judah
Bathsheba.
sleeps with, no, well, yeah, so there's
it
that
goes
one.
it
There's
goes.
David.
I know it comes through David and Bathsheba, but it goes even further back.
Right, because Judah has a baby with Tamar, right? It's like his sister, essentially. So Judah is having a child, like a bastard, basically, and Christ comes through that line. He comes through the messed up line. Instead of coming through the Levitical line, which is some completely orderly and right and exactly according to the law and as it should be, he picks
That's
Judah. He
fascinating.
comes through David, the sinner, the bastard
Through
child
a messed up
of
line,
Bathsheba.
totally messed up because it goes Bathsheba, then it goes clear back to Judah and Tamar.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Like, and that's such a crazy and important point.
Do you think he came through that line to clean that line up, to live the perfect life, and somehow, I know that he atoned for all of our sins, but does it have somehow direct reference to the line of Judah?
Yes, because he's telling a story. The story he's telling of is one of redemption. He's saying, look,
This is
even
so
if this line
beautiful.
is so messed up, even if it's crazy, I'm going to pick that line and I'm going to make it holy. And why is that important? Because Mormonism is that exact same story. Like, it makes sense that Joseph Smith and that Brigham Young would be messed up because all of Christianity has this exact same system like the Jews did, right? They've got their Levites and it's the Catholic Church and they've got their priests and their popes and everything. And here comes Joseph Smith, this misfit, right? And not only that, he sins and he messed up. But God is going to choose Joseph and he's going to put him above his brethren, right? And his brethren would be like, what the heck?
This
Like
makes
the
me,
Mormons are suddenly,
just so you know, Lance, this makes me feel much better. Just so you know, my father was 21 and my birth mother was 14. I was adopted as a baby. And so it makes me feel better that, like, even because I always felt like I came through a messed up line, right? Like my whole thing was like messed up. So this makes me feel much better about that. So thank you.
yeah. And it's the whole story of the Bible from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, even Nephi. Nephi is not he doesn't have the birthright. God is always, even Cain and Abel. Cain is the birthright. He's the older one. He's the one offering the acceptable sacrifice of vegetables because God had said, don't kill. And so he's like, well, here's my offering. It's the vegetables. I'm not going to kill. I'm not that unholy and horrible person. And Abel's like, look, I'm going to kill something and give it to you. And Abel's like, what the heck? He said, don't kill. You think God's going to accept that? And yet God accepts Abel's sacrifice and rejects Cain, even though Cain is doing everything right. Right? This is the story, the whole story of the gospel of God rejecting the people who are prideful and think they're doing everything right because they don't understand that God, the sacrifice never was the thing that they think it is. It's a broken heart and a contrite spirit. So this is that same narrative too with Mormonism. Like, you want to be founded on the right foundation. You want to keep your testimony. Understand that what is going to make the church or you or anybody chosen, it's going to be if we're humble. Like, it doesn't matter that there's sin in our lives, in our past. It doesn't matter if there's sin in the church's past. If Joseph Smith was a sinner, if Brigham Young was a sinner, none of that matters, right? In fact, that is all part of the narrative that God is constantly trying to talk about with redemption. He will take the unholy, horrible, cast off, unclean, adulterous woman, right? His church, his bride, who's an adulterer. He's going to take that and he is going to make it holy and he's going to put it above everyone else.
And it shares a story that becoming perfect is through the process of being imperfect for all of us, right? I mean, we're all imperfect, but we're imperfect for a reason because we're like that rough stone rolling that as it rolls down that hill, it becomes smooth. And that's the case. So it's teaching us this story that is for all of us. So we're all imperfect and it's part of the process. And this story should give us hope and not have us be like, well, I'm imperfect, so therefore I'm a throwaway. No, I mean, God, it's all by this perfect design.
Yeah, yeah. It's the fallen hero and the story of redemption, right? The story everyone wants to hear, the underdog.
Yeah.
And we should embrace it. Right. And so I have a lot of other, like concepts in here, but maybe we don't really necessarily need to go over a bunch of them because this is really just the most important part that it doesn't matter. And I think it's quite likely, like Joseph Smith sinned, he did something wrong. Who knows exactly what the extent was? He opened the door to it. Brigham Young, he did a cover up. Like, one of them did a cover up. It was either Joseph, Hiram, and Emma who lied and then did a cover up, or it was Brigham and his cohorts. One of them did. Who cares which one it was? I think it was probably the second. I think it might have been both a little bit, but it doesn't matter because God is going to redeem us as soon as we kind of rearrange our thinking. We understand that prophets make mistakes. We understand that this is the narrative, that God wants to redeem the fallen, and that none of that matters. What matters is that we repent as a church, right? And start living the full law of the gospel. And the only thing that we really have left that we really need to do great is consecration. Like as soon as we get back to that law of consecration, as soon as we become one as a people, we 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 court all of those apostates, people who've left the church because of these stupid issues, and we say, hey, it doesn't matter. We're here to serve each other and to consecrate our stuff.
Lance, what do you think it looks like in your mind if the church were to come out and say disavowing polygamy, it's not a thing. A man can only be sealed to one woman to one man. Like, what I think the church is nervous to do that because I see lots of challenges with that. But at the same time, I could see lots of people that have left, or even people that are being taught and then they learn about polygamy to be able to go back and say, no, this was a mistake. This is disavowed. Like, what do you think that does? And do you see that, like, in all of your visions and everything that's going on? Do you see a day where that happens?
I've had lots of thoughts about the future of the church. Like, in the first part, I think the church has already disavowed polygamy for the most part. So what's left? Just like the sealings. And that seems kind of minor, but I think that is something that needs to happen, right? You should only be sealed to one person. I think two, it's possible, and I should actually say it's inevitable, because we've seen it happen continually, that there will continue to be factions of the church that break off, and who knows, maybe at some point it'll be an actually kind of large faction that will practice polygamy. And if there are a lot of people in their hearts that are desiring polygamy, like, you're going to be reborn into one of those factions. Like in the millennium, do you want to come forth in the millennium in a faction of the church that practices polygamy? Well, if you desire polygamy, that's what's going to happen. Like, God gives you the desires of your heart.
That's why I'm choosing to take the stance right now and have a position right now. Because if I go and get hit by a bus tomorrow, I want to make sure that I end up in a place that I believe there isn't that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I'm okay wherever that is. But I understand that whatever it is I believe now travels with me. And
Yeah.
it's my opinion in a terrestrial or celestial state that polygamy is not a thing. I've come to that conclusion on my own through my own personal revelation. And I want to make sure that I believe that. So if I do get hit by a bus, I'm going to wherever that is.
Yeah. And I mean, the Law of One has a little section that is really powerful, because it talks about the process, like, right? So if you end up with a celestial resurrection, right? And you end up getting resurrected or reincarnated basically into a group that has polygamy, like, is that really what you want? There's a Law of One says basically, like, people who, this is what the ideal that I think the church is setting people up for, that you want. If you have one person and you love that person with all your heart, it talks about how that pairings throughout existence, like that they will find each other, right? That you will just end up marrying your love. And that's what we want. Like, when you're sealed to someone in the temple, like, your goal is to find.
Yeah, no, I know, because I feel like I hope my wife watches this because I'll get great brownie points for this. But I'm being sincere. Like, I feel like I found that. I was 40 years old. I had to go through prison, and I feel like I found that. I found my love. I found my best friend. I found that. And I believe that is a thing, 100%. So
Yeah, that's what everyone should be seeking for, because like, I believe that the people who, like, find each other in this life and just fall, like, madly in love, like, they find this person and their heart just, like, jumps out of their chest because, like, oh my gosh, this person is, like, a part of me. Why? Because they have experience with them in previous lives. Like, that's what we're going for. Who doesn't want that? Like, that is the ideal love story. So the idea of being sealed to one person in this life is so that in next lives you can have that experience, right? Like, that's what we're going for. And if you introduce polygamy into your heart, like, it's pretty similar to adultery. It's like, it's ruining, it's ruining your chances to have that amazing love in future lives, right? In the resurrection, in the millennium. So yeah, we do. We need to disavow that as a church. We need to disavow being sealed to multiple people. And I think that maybe being sealed to multiple people doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be polygamous in the next life. You're going to have to choose. But why not make that choice in this life? So, or maybe in the next life, the same thing will happen. You'll have be married with someone and then die, or like you have to. Anyway, there's so many complexities, and we figure them out ourselves.
I often wonder that wherever Brigham is and all of those people, they believed in their heart that it was a celestial law, that it was part of exaltation. And I often wonder if like the reason why this is bubbling to the surface is somehow they've received revelation over wherever they are that, it's not a thing. And in order to progress, we have to disavow it. And that's why we have so much online debate about this topic, because we have those that are in the spirit world influencing those here on earth. And there's that debate happening there. And so this is bubbling back up to the surface again.
Yeah. I mean, so who knows? I mean, it's possible that Joseph and part of the church is in a higher level in the spirit world than Brigham. And I mean, the spirit world is a little subjective anyway. From we've done videos on that. I've read so many life after death experiences and so many like people who've gone to the spirit world and come back. It's so complex, and speculating on it just gets into the weeds of what can't be known necessarily. But it's interesting to think about.
Okay, do you have anything else on your Gathered in One site on this that we want to wrap up with? I love the work you've done on what it actually means to raise up seed. And it does not mean to increase population. So that is scripturally true. And I would encourage anybody who thinks that they can find scriptures, Lance, the work you've done, like there's no human on earth that's done the kind of work that you've done on so many of these topics.
Yeah, I mean, on this topic, there's probably a lot of people who have done a lot more than me, but I think these are some important thoughts that are being missed that I hope people really hit. And there's one other thought that I want to really put into everyone's head before we chime off. Okay, I want everyone, when it comes to the argument of whether God sent an angel with a flaming sword to tell Joseph Smith to participate in polygamy, right? It's possible that happened. It's possible also that those are kind of conspiratorial thoughts that were put in. Most of them come from Brigham Young's wives, who were supposedly Joseph's wives, who probably, I think, actually weren't. That Joseph Smith or that Brigham Young was actually kind of doing a cover up with the Temple Law case and all this. But I just want everyone to think of this, like, and you hit this in your last episode when you talked about your dream. If an angel with flaming sword came to Joseph Smith, it was not an angel of God. And how do we know that? We know that because the movie Back to the Future tells us, right? So we got to watch this because it's so awesome. And I hope it comes to everybody's mind whenever we talk about the angel and the flaming
Trevor,
sword.
how do we make sure that the audio plays on this when he plays?
Oh, let me really quick hit it. This is so funny because it's like, anyway, it's perfect. Okay, think about this. This is basically the story that's being concocted by somebody, that the angel came to introduce polygamy.
Who are you? Silence, Earthling! My name is Darth Vader. I am an extraterrestrial from the planet Vulcan.
This line is probably the best one. Let's see.
Hey, George, buddy, you weren't in school. What have you been doing all day? I overslept. Look, I need your help. I have to ask Lorraine out, but I don't know how to do it.
All right, okay, listen, keep your pants on. She's over in the cafe. God, honey.
Okay, this is the best line right here. Dude, I think of Latter-day Chad when I see Marty McFly. He's like cool Marty McFly. Oh, here's him.
Came down from planet Vulcan and told me that if I didn't take Lorraine out, that he'd melt my brain.
Yeah, well, let's just...
That is Latter-day Chad. That's Latter-day Chad.
It full on is Latter-day Chad. Latter-day Chad is cool Marty McFly. But anyway, that line, like whenever we talk about the angel coming down and saying, you have to practice polygamy, it is full on Darth Vader from the planet Vulcan saying, if you don't practice polygamy, I'll melt your brain. You know what I mean? Totally. Anyone is going to see that and be like, yeah, that's not God. That's
Yeah.
not God. And I can't honestly imagine that Joseph Smith fell for that. I don't think he did. I think that's really saying Joseph was dumber than he was. I think that was a story that's concocted later by people. But like I say, it's a conspiracy on one part, and we don't know who it is. Everyone should pray and get that idea. But I think that Joseph opened the door, but Brigham then did this elaborate kind of hoax and cover up and everything,
Yeah.
just trying to save face and trying to protect Joseph's reputation and the church's reputation. He's well-meaning, but he was a David. Brigham Young was a David. He was an empire builder. And he did a great job at that, but he's probably in a lower place than Brigham. I don't know. Who knows? Why speculate on that? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's not important to our salvation.
Let's hope that they all raise their vibration. Let's hope. Hey, Brigham, if you're watching this, man, hopefully that you've learned whatever the truth is that you need to learn, and we can raise the vibration to whatever the truth is. And I think at the end of the day, I just want the truth. As it relates for me, I just want whatever's true. I want to know the truth. And whatever that is, I'm totally cool with it. But I know what the truth is for me. And so there's a truth that I have done my own work and I choose to believe. I believe Lance has done the same thing. You can go to his Gathered in One site and you can see all the work that he's done. And I would say this, like, if you want to know the truth, go do the work. Go do the work. Study it out in your mind. Ponder it out. Look at the evidence. And then pray. And if any man lacks wisdom, we already know the answer to that. God will give it to them. So, okay, Lance, thank you so much for joining us. This has been another interesting conversation about polygamy, and I learned something really important about what it actually means to raise up seed. And so I hope that enters into the discussion. I hope people take this and realize that doesn't mean to increase the population, at least not according to the scriptures. That sounds like if increasing the population is what it means in the scriptures to raise up seed, it sounds like this old adage, the philosophies of men mingled with scripture is what that sounds like to me. So anyways, Lance, thank you so much. Trevor, any final thoughts as we wrap up here? Nope. Okay. Trevor, he's going to need some rest today. He was up late recording Midnight Mormons. Lance was there. We couldn't get his mic to work. But we're excited about all the things that are happening and coming about. So for myself, I'm Shane Baldwin. For Trevor the Key Keys and Lancelot Weaver, we'll see you all next time.
He came before, just as foretold. The heavens open, the story unfolds. Hands outstretched, his scars were shown. The Lamb who saves, the King we've known. He came once, he'll come again, to gather his flock, to bring the end. The scars remain, his love still shines. Prepare your hearts, the hour aligns. They touched his hands, they knew his name. The prophesied Son, the Lamb who was slain. He walked among them, their hearts set free. The risen Christ of eternity. He came once, he'll come again, to gather his flock, to bring the end. The scars remain, his love still shines. Prepare your hearts, the hour aligns. Behold his hands, behold his feet. Feel his love, his scars so deep. The King will reign, his truth will rise. speaks. His voice is clear.